Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. I want to start off today, before we get into the Indian Removal Act, with just setting the stage because as we move with this new chapter that we're focusing on, is we're looking at the South. And much of the South, obviously, leading up to the Civil War, is dominated by the issue of slavery. And it's very difficult for people to rationalize how someone can treat someone else in such a terrible, poor manner, and it's very, very difficult for people of modern times to really understand that. And if you were to ask a slave owner at the time, hey, what do you think you're doing? Why are you doing this? They would come up with several answers, none of which are in the slightest convincing, but they would have answers nonetheless. Nonetheless, one of the things is obviously slavery is obviously based, on racism. There's no question about that. But we're also talking about an idea called social Darwinism. Now, you guys have probably heard of Darwinism, and of course, that refers to natural selection. And natural selection obviously means that you're in nature. And when you are in society, it is no longer natural selection and therefore has nothing remotely close to do with what Darwin was suggesting. So the people who use social Darwinism have it so wrong on so many levels that it really is embarrassing. It just goes to show their complete lack of understanding of the biological concept of Darwinism. However, they that did not let the they did not stop the slave owners from still using that argument, even though we've just explained what a preposterous argument it is. Now, social Darwinism says that people are in their current condition, meaning, wealthy, poor, smart, stupid, free, slave, etc., due to their lack of ability or their ability. So, meaning that if you're rich, it's because you worked hard, and if you're smart, it's because you studied hard, and, if you're poor, it's because you're lazy, all these things which we obviously know through life experience and just observing everyday reality that it is complete and utter nonsense. So social Darwinism is completely wrong, and the slave owners used it in some way to justify the fact that people were slaves, and that was what they, I guess, deserved, for lack of a better term. The more honest explanation is that slavery was an economic necessity. Now, necessity might be putting it a little bit too much. Of course, you could pay people, just not pay them that much, and you'd still make a lot of money. But certainly, slavery was a major economic benefit, and many of the white Southerners relied on slavery for their continued prosperity. The Bible also has many references to slavery, and some people's interpretation the Bible seems to justify slavery, and the logic would be, well, if it's in the Bible, then I can do it too. Of course, that has so many flaws in the argument that it's probably take another entire lesson just to talk about the flaws. Another one was that inequality was okay because inequality was the natural state of the world. Think about predators versus prey. Some in nature, there's some that are predators and are designed to hunt and be the killer, and others are sort of designed, if you will, lack of a better term, are there to be food and to eat grass and things like that. And they're saying, look, the world isn't equal everywhere that you go, so equality is not the standard in nature. So why would it be the standard in our day-to-day life? The other thing we'll call paternalistic, and that is when the government or someone who's not your parent acts in a manner as a parent and treats you like a dependent. And slave owners' very unconvincing argument was that, well, we provide food, clothing, and shelter, and so without us, what would the slaves do? And the answer, of course, is probably live just fine as long as you left them alone. But again, there's no excuse for slavery whatsoever. And even though these were the excuses given, they are all completely invalid. Well, moving on to another very unhappy chapter in our history is the Indian Removal Act. And James Monroe initially proposed that Indians be moved west of the Mississippi River. At that point, west of the Mississippi was this land that no one really knew what was there. It was still being sort of explored after the Louisiana Purchase. And Monroe believed that the Indians would willingly move because they would be safe from white invasion and would be independent. And of course, when you ask someone to move from a land that they've been on for literally hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of years, to make room for you, it's not going to go over too well. And obviously, the Indians were very upset about this. Congress did pass the Indian Removal Act, which allowed the president to negotiate treaties with Indians. Now, of course, we have a horrible, horrible, horrible record of not keeping any of the treaties that we've negotiated with the Indians. Um, One of the main Supreme Court cases was Worcester versus Georgia. And this was to figure out what is the status of the Indian nation, the Cherokee nation within the United States. And the Supreme Court Justice, John Marshall, said that the Cherokee nation was completely independent from Georgia. Georgians could not enter Cherokee land without permission. It was almost like it's another country, and this was a celebrated decision, at least for the Indians, because they said, "Oh wow, look, we're actually being recognized now. The law of the land has just recognized that we are a sovereign nation. So this is fantastic." Now, of course, Andrew Jackson, who was the president, said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Now, of course, as Andrew Jackson, I'm sure, knew, being president means that you are in charge of enforcing the laws. And so when Andrew Jackson tells the judge whose job it is to enforce the laws, he is intentionally not doing his duty and intentionally violating the Constitution. And not only was this a moral embarrassment for the United States, also an intellectual one. And history has judged both the Indian removal, Worcester versus Georgia, and all three, I should say, and Andrew Jackson's statement as completely inappropriate. And finally, the forced removal of the Indians, as you guys know, was called the Trail of Tears. These estimates are rough. We don't exactly know. We say 20,000 initially Cherokees were forcibly removed from their homeland, marched under military escort. Many died on the way. The land was unfamiliar. I mean, look at where you're starting from. You're starting from these sort of areas, the South, and you're moving all the way over to the plains areas of the Midwest. I mean, can you imagine how unbelievably difficult it would be? And these new lands were unfamiliar. They did not allow the Indians to live the life that they were used to, and unfortunately, many became dependent on federal assistance. So it was a very, very sad story from all aspects. Well, that does it. Thank you for listening.